Hey guys, tonight we step into a world of corsets, curtsies, and a surprising amount of supervision. You're attending your first Victorian courtship, except it's not candlelit strolls or swooning glances across ballroom floors. No, you're about to meet your potential soulmate, while a stern aunt looms in the corner like a hawk guarding a teacup. Victorian dating wasn't just unromantic, it was logistical warfare wrapped in lace. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe, especially if you're into the kind of stories they never taught you in school. And hey, drop a comment with your city and the time. Let's see how far this story travels. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Think your first date was awkward? Try having it narrated by your governess. It starts with a knock. Not on your door, on your family's parlor. Because you as a young Victorian lady are never alone with a man, not even on the front stoop. If someone wishes to call upon you, they're making an appointment through your mother, possibly your father, and almost certainly under the watchful gaze of at least one chaperone. The meet cute, it's less, oops, I dropped my fan, and more, your family and his met during tea at Lady Ashworth's, and the mothers hit it off, discussing embroidery patterns. You sit together in the parlor, flanked by a cousin pretending to read, and your governess, who's knitting but missing nothing. He compliments your piano playing. You thank him without smiling too much anything more. Might signal impropriety. You sip tea. You speak softly. You do not laugh loudly. Historians still argue whether this rigid supervision was genuinely protective or simply performative, a kind of curated morality theater to protect upper middle class reputations. Chaperones weren't just a Victorian quirk. They were seen as guardians of virtue, and by extension, family honor. If you think overbearing parents are a modern trope, imagine needing written permission just to talk to someone in private. Men, too, had rules to follow. A gentleman could not just stroll into your home uninvited. He left a calling card first, essentially a cardboard flirtation token, and waited for your family's reply. If invited, he came dressed appropriately, spoke with deference, and never overstayed his welcome. There were no surprise flowers or last-minute coffee dates. Romance was scheduled. Visits occurred at specific hours in public areas of the home, often with multiple people around. Courtship wasn't designed to spark passion. It was a vetting process. You weren't auditioning for love. You were demonstrating stability, lineage, and social worth. Still, you found small ways to rebel. Perhaps your hands brushed slightly while reaching for the teapot. Perhaps you dared to ask a personal question like, his favorite poet. Scandalous. And yet there was a tension beneath it all, a repressed, buzzing undercurrent that gave even these stifled encounters a strange electricity. You weren't allowed to feel much, so every glance, every tiny gesture became a thunderclap. In certain circles, especially among the aristocracy, elaborate matchmaking events filled entire seasons. The London season wasn't just for opera and dances, it was a matrimonial meat market with daughters on display and family fortunes in the balance. One historian described it as a series of transactions masquerading as dances. And the chaperone, the banker watching the balance sheet. Still, despite or because of this rigid setup, there were occasional slip-ups. The cousin dozes off. The governess steps out. For a fleeting moment, you're alone. You steal a whispered conversation about books. He says he prefers Byron. You pretend not to blush. That's it. That's your moment. And it might be the most alone you'll ever be with him, until after your wedding. Want to whisper sweet nothings? Better hope your mom approves the draft. You sit at your writing desk, feather pen poised, ink barely dry. The paper beneath your hand is creamy and thick, good stock, suitable for the kind of message that might someday be read by candlelight, then tucked secretly into a Bible or burned in a hearth. You're writing to him, of course, but not directly. Oh no, Victorian love letters were rarely a private affair. They passed through many hands, often quite literally. Your mother might review your note for tone. A servant might deliver it, passing it to his family's footman, who hands it off to his valet. It's like a postal relay for feelings only with a very nosy pit crew. You want to say something tender, maybe quote a poem, but you have to consider your phrasing carefully. Any overt sentiment might not survive family scrutiny. Even the word affection walks a tightrope too warm and eyebrows rise, too cold and you sound indifferent. So, instead, you reference shared interests. The performance at Lady Halcomb's was most stirring. I do hope your appreciation for Schubert remains undiminished. Translation. I liked sitting next to you while the string quartet played. I wish we could talk more. Letters often included safe topics, garden updates, books, read, music, enjoyed, all coded with subtext that both parties pretended not to notice. Historians still argue whether these evasions strengthened intimacy or just made everyone better at passive aggression. In some families, even incoming letters were intercepted. A younger brother might be tasked with reading aloud anything addressed to Miss Eleanor, just to ensure propriety. You might be tempted to hide correspondence in a novel's dust jacket. Charlotte Bronte reportedly did just that. But even then, you risk discovery. And the format ornate, of course. Letters opened with elaborate greetings. Dearest Miss Langley, I trust this note finds you in excellent health. By the time you actually got to your point, half the page was formal pleasantry. But buried in all that fluff might be a coded sentence. I hope the lilacs are blooming in your garden, which he would know referred to the lilac corsage you wore at your last meeting. Courting couples developed private symbol systems, not unlike spies. A certain flower pinned to a bonnet might mean I'm thinking of you. A slightly skewed stamp on the envelope. I wish we could speak more freely. One fringe tidbit. Some particularly bold couples wrote letters using lemon juice as invisible ink. Heated over a lamp, the message would appear, but only if you knew to look. Of course, the risk of burning the paper or alerting a vigilant aunt was always present. If letters were the heartbeat of courtship, the ink was pulsed with caution. Emotional honesty was often buried under metaphor, and metaphors could be interpreted, misinterpreted, or intercepted. There were letter-writing manuals too, guides with sample templates for every occasion. Need to politely refuse a suitor while preserving social grace. There's a paragraph for that. Want to express measured interest without indecorous excitement? Flip to page 48. Meanwhile, you're sitting at your desk again, pen hovering, trying to describe how your heart skipped when he said your name. But instead you write your account of the Harvest Festival, was most diverting. And maybe he reads between the lines. Or maybe he doesn't. Either way, the letter arrives. He reads it in his study, folds it carefully, and places it in his coat pocket. A quiet smile. Then the sound of footsteps. He's off to write a reply, equally polite, equally veiled. And the dance continues. They called it courtship. You'd call it a job interview with doilies. You smooth the folds of your muslin gown and glance at the grandfather clock in the hall. He's due to arrive at precisely 4 o'clock. Not 3:59, not 4:01. Victorian courtship ran on precision, and the punctuality of a suitor was interpreted as a measure of both manners and marital potential. He enters with polished boots and a posture carved by boarding school. He bows. Your father offers a curt nod. Your mother, resplendent in a sea of lace and social calculation, gestures him toward the settee. You remain standing. It wouldn't do to appear too eager. He's not here to woo you, not yet. He's here to be assessed. This is less of a flirtation and more of an informal interview. In the Victorian age, love came second, sometimes third. First came compatibility, by which society meant class income and reputation. The unspoken question floating in the room is this: is he good enough for our daughter? And is she useful enough for his legacy? Historians still debate whether this approach was purely transactional or masked a deeper cultural belief that emotional love was unreliable. Either way, affection was considered a perk, not a prerequisite. His credentials are whispered about long before he speaks a modest country estate, a solid education at Eton, an uncle in Parliament. Your mother knows how many servants he employs. Your father already reviewed his standing in Debrett's peerage. You, meanwhile, are appraised on a different scale. Your dowry, your complexion, your piano repertoire, and your capacity for agreeable conversation, which means nodding a lot and not interrupting when men discuss the Crimea. This isn't cynical, it's strategy. Marriage was a business arrangement wrapped in ribbon. Everyone understood their role. Still, you try to smile. You comment on the weather. You ask if he enjoys poetry, safely neutral ground. He replies with a reference to Tennyson. You mentally note has read at least one book. And what if he's dull? What if he's dreadful? Too bad. As a woman of good standing, your options are limited. To reject a respectable offer without cause risks rumors too proud, too difficult, not serious about marriage. Worse, it could damage your siblings' chances by association. You're not just dating for yourself. You're representing your entire bloodline. Men face pressure too, of course. A second son with no inheritance couldn't marry without money. A titled gentleman might be expected to marry up in wealth, even if it meant marrying down in intellect. And woe betide the man who fell for a governess, or heaven forbid a woman, who'd been previously compromised. But there were loopholes. A man might attempt to charm the parents, bring gifts, offer flattering observations about the home, ask for gardening tips. Some families viewed this as sincerity. Others sniffed out such efforts as social climbing. One curious tidbit: some wealthy families hired genealogists to investigate a potential match's ancestry. Romantic dinners often included a review of family trees just to ensure no scandals lurked in the fifth cousin range. At the end of the visit, he stands, offers a final bow, and leaves his calling card on the mantel. This tiny rectangle of paper, often embossed and delicately scented, is his placeholder. If your family approves, they'll invite him again. If not, his card mysteriously vanishes. No response. No rejection. Just silence. Later over tea, your mother discusses his posture, your father mutters about land taxes, and your great-aunt murmurs something about a nervous twitch in his left eye. You remain silent. Your opinion will be solicited, but only if it's convenient. You retire to your room, unsure whether you've passed the test or if he has. All you know is that courtship in your world is more resume than romance, and every step is a step on eggshells. You sit at the pianoforte, hands poised over the ivory keys, conscious not just of the notes you're about to play, but of the eyes watching you play them. A waltz, soft and simple, nothing too dramatic. Anything too expressive might come across as too eager. He watches from across the parlor, seated stiffly between your mother and your father's old friend from university. They discuss the grain yields in Devonshire. You, however, are putting on a performance of femininity, restraint, and cultural fluency. In Victorian society, the parlor was more than a living room. It was a stage. Courtship didn't blossom in dark corners or romantic picnics. It unfolded in bright, overheated rooms filled with doilies, ferns, and relatives with opinions. It was a group project. Parlor games were common charades, card games, embroidery circles, but all served the same purpose: to observe the suitor in a natural setting. Could he carry a conversation? Did he display appropriate mirth? Did he refrain from touching the upholstery with his gloves on? Yes, that was a thing. Historians still argue whether these events provided a genuine window into character or were simply theater of the absurd. Either way, they were the primary venue for romantic interaction. Flirtation was a delicate, often silent affair. A glance held half a second too long. A question about a shared book. The accidental, perhaps intentional brushing of gloved fingers while reaching for the biscuit tray. You might signal interest by adjusting your fan a certain way. He might tip his hat, ever so slightly, in your direction. Each gesture had weight. A misstep could provoke whispers. Or worse, a letter from your aunt in Bath. There were entire manuals on how to behave during parlor courtship. One advised, speak often but briefly. Be clever, but never wounding. Smile, but only once per subject. Even your laugh was regulated. Too hearty, and you risked sounding coarse. Too timid, and you seemed dull. You became an actress in your own house, reciting a role you never auditioned for. And then there was the music. A well-executed nocturne might say, I'm cultured and calm. A complicated mazurka, I have spirit, but not too much. Singing was tricky. A breathy soprano could charm. A wrong note could haunt you for weeks. Meanwhile, your suitor might recite a poem, badly, or worse, try to sketch your silhouette while you were unaware. One fringe detail some gentlemen took to demonstrating fencing forms in parlors, yes, swordplay in cramped spaces, because nothing says marriage material like brandishing a foil near a fern. If conversation stalled, you might be asked to read aloud. Always something tasteful. Tennyson Austen, maybe a moral tale. You read, and he watches you turn the pages. Not too fast. Not too slow, never dog ear, and all around the family listens. Not just to the words, but to the tone. Is there too much warmth in his voice when he says your name? Does your foot tap when he speaks of Venice? These details, tiny as they seem, form the entire basis of Victorian courtship. There were no diaries of long walks under the stars. There were parlor evenings full of coded gestures and repressed emotions where everyone smiled and no one exhaled. You finish your waltz. There's a polite smattering of applause. He nods approvingly. You allow yourself one soft smile. Then the moment's gone. It's someone else's turn to perform. You hear the door open downstairs. The butler announces his arrival, not with words but with the soft click of a silver tray. Your suitor's calling card placed upon it, like a diplomatic overture. You don't even touch the card. Your mother does. He's made a formal call. Again. That makes 3 this month. The frequency isn't romantic, it's math. Victorian courtship operated on calculations, not just of status, but of timing, visibility, and persistence. Every visit was recorded, scrutinized, and eventually interpreted. You're ushered into the drawing room. The same flower arrangement, the same chintz upholstery. It's less a date and more a chess match on doilies. The rules of calling were precise. A gentleman could only call at certain hours, usually between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. He had to leave within 15 to 30 minutes. Any longer suggested impropriety or arrogance. And if your family didn't return the call, that was a silent refusal. Calling cards themselves were small marvels, engraved thick, sometimes gold-edged. A few gentlemen left cards with tiny handwritten notes with the greatest respect. A brave move, but also risky. The wrong flourish could spell disaster. Historians still argue whether this elaborate system was rooted more in control or convenience. Either way, it created a dance of gestures without words, each one freighted with consequence. The moment he leaves the card, the gears begin to turn. If your family returns the visit, it's a green light. If not, you both pretend nothing happened. There's no ghosting in the modern sense. There's simply a permanent silence preserved under a layer of social sugar. And then there's the infamous morning call. Not an early visit, but a trap for the uninitiated. If a gentleman called before noon, he marked himself as uncouth or foreign. Morning was for business, not flirtation. Even the way a card was folded carried meaning. A corner turned down. He came in person. A corner folded in. He left it himself. But no one was home. 2 corners folded. He came on horseback and got rained on. Okay, that last one's a joke, but only barely. Some fringe enthusiasts collected calling cards, filing them in tiny albums like romantic tax receipts. You imagine someone, years from now, flipping through pages of crisp, untouched cards. No scribbles, no annotations. Just names and dates. Ghosts of conversations that never happened. Your suitor sits across from you, gloved hands resting on his knees. He doesn't lean too close. He doesn't laugh too loud. He praises the wallpaper. You ask about his dog. He asks about your embroidery. You say you're working on a pastoral scene. You do not mention the part where the sheep look like lumpy potatoes. That would be too honest. Every comment is a breadcrumb. A safe, strategic breadcrumb. The room smells like violets and furniture polish. The seconds pass like teaspoons of molasses. And then he rises, just as your father clears his throat. Perfect timing. He bows, leaves his hat in hand, and exits with a final nod to the butler. Another visit complete. Back upstairs, you sit at your vanity pondering the visit. He was polite, handsome enough, smelled faintly of lavender. You suppose he might do. But you can't shake the feeling that dating in your world is less about falling in love and more about not making a mistake. Forget Tinder. This was matchmaking via Morse code and embroidery patterns. You're in the conservatory now, surrounded by the scent of overwatered ferns and the quiet rustle of taffeta skirts. You're not alone. Of course not. Your mother perches nearby, with her embroidery every stitch somehow aligning with your heartbeat. She's not just supervising, she's orchestrating. In the Victorian world, mothers were not gentle guides in the background. They were the frontline generals of your romantic campaign. Her role was less Cupid, more commandant. From the moment your social debut was announced, likely with a stiff little notice in the Morning Post, your mother became your unofficial agent. She tracked eligible bachelors, vetted dowries, memorized family trees. She arranged which dances you were allowed to accept, which drawing rooms you'd visit, and which invitations mysteriously got lost. Historians still debate whether Victorian mothers were power-hungry matchmakers, or women simply navigating the only influence society allowed them. Probably both. She has your best interests at heart, but those interests are defined by stability, not spontaneity. She remembers the scandal with cousin Eleanor and the opera singer. She knows the damage a single misstep can cause, not just to you, but to your siblings, your father's professional standing, even your family's church pew assignment. You smile at your suitor. He compliments the hydrangeas. Your mother coughs once, just once, and somehow the topic shifts to his plans for settling down. Every conversation is a minefield, and your mother, she's holding the map. Some mothers were famously tyrannical, recorded in diaries as unbearably watchful. Others were subtle manipulators, playing host and interrogator in the same breath. A few went so far as to sit between their daughters and suitors on the settee, just in case. And yet occasionally, the armor slips. Your mother might catch your glance at him and say nothing. She might adjust your hair before a garden party with unexpected gentleness. She wants you to succeed in the way she defines success. Fringe tidbit. Some mothers bribed footmen to eavesdrop on guests and report back. One particularly strategic duchess allegedly kept a journal tracking every eligible bachelor's preferred desserts information she wielded with terrifying accuracy. Your own mother may not be quite so intense, but she's no fool. She notices when you blush. She frowns when your laugh lingers too long. Her silence after his visit says more than any words. Even your wardrobe is her domain. She selects fabrics that suggest purity but hint at sophistication. Pastel muslins, high necklines, just enough lace to flirt with decorum. Your opinions are considered of course and swiftly overridden. At dinner, she drops his name casually. At tea, she mentions his aunt's gout. These are not random remarks. They're probes, testing your response, your tone, your facial muscles, and you've learned to answer in code. He seems kind, means I might actually like him. He is very punctual. means please let's never speak of him again, your father. He plays the background character. He asks one or two questions, usually about horses or politics, and then disappears into the study. This is your mother's arena. In the rare moment when you're alone briefly, perhaps in the hallway, as guests arrive, your mother squeezes your hand. Remember, she says you mustn't give him too much encouragement. Not yet. Then she's gone, her silhouette drifting into the parlor like a curtain drawn against too much light. You take a breath. You smile. You step forward. The next act begins. It's Thursday, which means he's calling again. The third Thursday this month, to be exact. That's not a coincidence. It's a pattern. And in Victorian society, patterns meant everything. Courtship had its own calendar. Visits weren't spontaneous gestures of affection. They were scheduled events, choreographed with military precision. One visit a month suggested polite curiosity. 2 implied growing interest. 3 meant something was brewing, and every eye in your household was watching closely. You wait in the drawing room. The same embroidered armchairs, the same ticking mantel clock. Your hands are folded just so your hair styled to the day's particular expectations. This is not just a conversation. It's a reputational performance. He arrives exactly on time. Not too early improper. Not too late disrespectful. Punctuality is interpreted as a form of sincerity, just as tardiness hints at wandering affections or poor upbringing. He bows. You curtsy. The dance resumes. And as you speak, always carefully, always quietly, you can feel the arithmetic clicking behind the scenes. Your mother stationed nearby, with her needlepoint notes how long he stays. Your sister tallies how often he glances at you. Even the housemaid likely has a running commentary. Victorian society believed in rules because it feared chaos, especially romantic chaos. So your every interaction became a kind of public ledger. A courtship that moved too quickly sparked suspicion. Too slowly, and it withered. Historians still argue whether this ritualization of affection created deeper bonds or simply masked shallow ones with polite timing. Some claim the structure allowed feelings to grow safely. Others insist it simply prolonged the inevitable. Either way, reputation was always on the line. A young woman who encouraged a suitor without reciprocating could be labeled a flirt. A man who visited often and then disappeared might be accused of trifling. The social fallout could ripple across entire family networks. One misstep at the wrong party, one overheard remark, and your name could become complicated. There were even unwritten visitation equations. For example, if he attended 3 events at your family's home, but none at public venues, it suggested seriousness. But if he danced with you only twice per evening, he might be keeping his options open. It's practically algebra with lace. One fringe tidbit. Some elite families kept private courtship diaries, logging visitor names, arrival times, topics discussed, and noteworthy glances. You imagine your entry today. Mr. Fairweather arrived at 4:01 p.m. Inquired after orchids. Left by 4:31. Smiled twice. Mentioned a cousin in the Navy. And how do you feel? Well, no one really asks that, at least not openly. You're expected to remain composed. Smile demurely, not too wide. Speak but only when spoken to. Demonstrate pleasing conversation and modest deportment, whatever those mean in practice. Mostly, it means being agreeable and uncontroversial. You ask him about his travels. He asks about your dog. You both comment on the wallpaper. He offers to bring you a book, Tennyson again, perhaps. You wonder if that's his only book. But there is one small rebellion eye contact, held just a second longer than before. You see something flicker hesitation, or maybe interest. It's not much. But in this world of choreographed propriety, it's everything. Then he stands. The visit ends. He bows. Your mother rises just half a second too early, and you realize she's seen it too. You walk him to the door. Not alone, of course. Never alone. But just close enough that your hands nearly brush as he leaves. Back inside, your mother says nothing. She picks up her needlepoint, but her stitches are tighter now. The calculation is changing. You slip out the side door of the garden, your slippers crunching ever so softly on the gravel. It's dusk, and you know you've only minutes, perhaps less, before someone notices you've gone missing. But he's there waiting by the far hedge, half in shadow, half in foolish hope. This is not proper. This is not chaperoned. This is entirely, gloriously reckless. For all the rules, the etiquette manuals, and the parlor rehearsals, Victorian couples still found ways to defy the system. Love. True, awkward, inconvenient love has a stubborn streak, and even in a society built to contain it, some pairs found cracks in the walls. Historians still argue whether these secret rendezvous were acts of passion or desperation. But one thing's certain: the more rigid the system, the more creative the rebellion. You meet under cover of twilight. A brief walk around the back lawn while everyone else is inside, distracted by brandy or croquet. A stolen conversation behind the church during Sunday services. Sometimes even a whispered moment inside a stationery shop, your fingers brushing as you reach for the same envelope. These moments weren't just risky, they were thrilling. The stakes were monumental. Being caught could mean public disgrace, familial wrath, or the immediate end of the relationship. And yet, you persist. Sometimes it's a glance across the pews. Sometimes in the more cosmopolitan parts of London, couples engaged in accidental meetings at bookshops, galleries, or museum exhibits. The British Museum was an oddly popular choice. Plenty of corners, and nobody questioned a young lady interested in antiquities. One fringe detail. Some daring souls wrote entire courtship letters in the margins of library books. A volume of Tennyson once returned might bear a penciled plea. Page 47, third stanza, my heart. Others used hired intermediaries, maids, stable boys, even cab drivers to pass messages or arrange clandestine walks. There's record of one enterprising suitor who disguised himself as a chimney sweep to catch a glimpse of his beloved through the kitchen window. He nearly got brained with a ladle for his trouble. But it wasn't just about spectacle. These secret meetings were often the only chances couples had to speak plainly, to ask real questions, to test affection without the constant pressure of family expectations or social surveillance. You ask him tonight what he truly wants. He hesitates, then answers something quieter, maybe away from all this. It's not a proposal, not yet, but it's something real. You smile. You whisper something back. Nothing scandalous, just sincere. And in that moment, you understand why so many took the risk. Back at the house, the lamps are being lit. The maid, who covered for you with a whispered, "She's upstairs resting," is glancing toward the garden, nerves fraying. You return just in time, cheeks flushed with more than the chill. Your mother frowns, but says nothing. Did she know, perhaps? Or perhaps she chooses not to see. After all, every Victorian house had its secrets. Some just wore better lace. You climb the stairs to your room, heart beating like a waltz. Tomorrow, you'll be back in the parlor, sipping tea and discussing orchids. But tonight, you had a moment of your own. You're sitting at your writing desk again. But this time, it's not to pen a letter. You're just staring at the wood grain, wondering how something so ordinary could become a battleground for thoughts that shouldn't even exist, because you've touched his hand, briefly, accidentally. And now you can't stop thinking about it. Victorian dating wasn't just chaperoned, it was shackled by sexual repression, so complete that even an innocent graze of the fingers could feel scandalous. You don't talk about desire. You don't think about desire. You certainly don't act on desire. And yet, here you are, pulse rising over a memory of shared sheet music. In this world, physical affection is restricted to the imagination. You won't be kissed before marriage. You won't even be alone long enough to consider it. Romantic novels hint at passion, but always discreetly. And female desire. That's relegated to medical textbooks, usually under hysteria. Historians still argue whether this level of repression truly reflected cultural norms or was exaggerated by upper-class etiquette. Either way, the result was the same silence guilt and a wide range of unspoken fantasies. The human body itself became suspect. Touch was controlled. Gaze was moderated. Even talking about the weather too enthusiastically could veer into dangerous territory. A sudden thunderstorm might provoke blushes. One odd workaround. Couples often expressed physical longing through objects. A lock of hair, a pressed flower, a glove forgotten on purpose. These became surrogate touches, tokens that carried meaning sent even imagined intimacy. You remember reading that Queen Victoria saved one of Prince Albert's nightshirts. It was folded, stored in a drawer, touched when words and bodies weren't allowed to meet. And then there were the even stranger substitutions. Fringe tidbit. In certain circles, people flirted by exchanging handkerchiefs sprayed with carefully chosen perfume blends, scent as suggestion. Others found scandalous meaning in the order of buttons or the placement of brooches. A brooch pinned just below the collarbone might say, "I'm thinking of you." One near the waist, "I shouldn't be." It's absurd. It's intoxicating. You find yourself deliberately brushing your fingertips against the piano keys because he once did the same. For men, the situation was no less fraught. Physical affection was both craved and condemned. Male desire had to be filtered through honor discipline and the vague threat of social exile. Courtship without physicality became a performance of restraint. And sometimes performance slipped into repression. Still, some found odd ways to connect. In one documented case, a couple played hand chess using a cloth over their hands so no one could see. The game was an excuse. The cloth. A flimsy barrier that heightened every move. The room full of people who never guessed. For many women, the body itself was a mystery. Modesty rules limited education about anatomy, even hygiene. A bride might enter marriage not just innocent of sex, but utterly unaware of its existence. Marriage manuals did exist, but were so vague they raised more questions than they answered, and the fear palpable. A single rumor of loose behavior could undo years of reputation building. Women were told to avoid even appearing too emotional, lest they be assumed impure. Men were advised to guide their wives' affections with firmness and reason. You stare at your reflection, now wondering who you are allowed to be. Your body apparently is not yours. Your desires, if you have them, are whispers meant to be locked away, not explored. Still, the next time he visits you, notice his eyes linger on your wrist as you pour the tea. A flicker of something, a shared secret barely born. Nothing more happens. Of course not. But later, alone in your room, you hold the cup to your lips and remember that moment. And you wonder, just for a second, what it would feel like to kiss someone before the vows. You're engaged, officially. There's a ring, delicate gold, perhaps with a modest garnet, and a small mountain of congratulatory cards that all seem to begin with such joy or what a match. But you're still never alone with him. That's the surprise. You thought engagement meant freedom, intimacy, maybe even the thrill of holding hands without a chaperone popping out of the hedges. But no, the watchfulness intensifies. If courtship was a test, engagement is the probation period. Your parents insist on stricter schedules. Visits become shorter, more public, more scripted. Any hint of impropriety now carries even higher stakes. After all, you're not just a young lady anymore. You're a betrothed woman, a title with more rules than romance. Historians still argue whether this strictness was a way to preserve chastity or a means to maintain control over volatile emotions. Possibly both. The Victorian engagement wasn't a lover's reprieve. It was a reputational tightrope. Even your letters are now monitored with a new intensity. More frequent, yes. More personal, only just. You might finally dare to write, "I miss your company," or "I long for our next walk." But still, no first names, no declarations of passion, no mention of physical longing. That would be vulgar. And privacy, practically non-existent. A supervised garden stroll is the most you can hope for. And even then, your younger brother is mysteriously also walking nearby, repeatedly asking reasons to adjust his bootlaces behind you. Fringe tidbit. In some households, engaged couples were allowed to sit together on a sofa, but only if the woman's maid or mother was in the room, pretending not to notice. One couple reportedly developed a form of Morse code by tapping their heels on the floor while speaking aloud about unrelated topics. Courtship by foot percussion. You meet his extended family now. Aunts, cousins, perhaps, even the dreaded godmother who pinches cheeks and interrogates bloodlines. You must impress them all, not just with manners, but with your understanding of your upcoming responsibilities. These include household management, charitable work, appropriate dress, proper child rearing, philosophies, and knowing not to speak of them until asked. He too is tested. Your father arranges quiet meetings to discuss financial matters. Your uncles weigh his handshake and eye contact like judges at a livestock fair. You watch him smile, nod, reassure, and wonder if you're glimpsing his real self, or just another layer of armor. And yet, amidst the decorum, there are flickers of something real. He offers to fetch your shawl during a walk. His hand grazes yours briefly, as if testing the possibility of touch. You think you hear his breath hitch, or maybe it's yours. You catch each other's eyes across a crowded T. You almost speak, but instead you smile. Not a performative one, a real one. Still, there are limits. One well-known etiquette book warned, even in engagement, a woman must guard her modesty, for familiarity breeds scandal. Another advised that a man should avoid dwelling too long upon her beauty, lest she think him shallow. So, you talk about books, and dogs, and the weather. Always the weather. And you wait. Wait for the day when you can walk beside him without a chorus of footsteps. When you can speak your mind without checking who's listening. When you can feel his hand in yours and know that no one will rush in to separate you with a polite cough. Until then, the ring glints quietly on your finger. A promise, a warning, a countdown, and a reminder, this isn't the finish line. It's just another checkpoint. The engagement is off. Not yours, thankfully, but someone else's. And the news spreads faster than marmalade at a breakfast table. Whispers slip through lace fans, across drawing rooms, down garden paths. Did you hear about Miss Ashby? Apparently he changed his mind. She must have done something. In Victorian society, breaking off an engagement wasn't just personal. It was catastrophic. This wasn't a minor social faux pas. It was a near-total reputational collapse, especially for women. And it's in the back of your mind every time your suitor so much as hesitates before answering a question about the future. Engagements, once announced, were seen as binding social contracts. Not quite legal, but dangerously close. A broken engagement raised suspicions had there been impropriety. Was one party found lacking? Who's to blame? Historians still argue whether the culture of engagement shaming was about protecting morality or punishing female agency. Probably both. The scales were never balanced. If a man withdrew, he was pitied, maybe warned about future cold feet. But if a woman ended the engagement, even with good cause, she faced a potential lifetime of stigma. She might be labeled difficult flighty or unsuitable for matrimony. One fringe tidbit: there were actual court cases in which jilted fiancés sued former suitors for breach of promise. Imagine airing your broken heart in public just to claw back some social currency. But what happened behind the scenes was often worse than any courtroom drama. Families scrambled to preserve dignity. She fell ill. He received a posting abroad. They realized they were better as friends. Carefully crafted lies stitched over emotional wounds. You watch it happen now in real time. Miss Ashby's name is quietly struck from invitations. She no longer sits near the fire at gatherings. Her dance card remains suspiciously empty. You hear her mother is unwell code for too humiliated to attend public events. And everyone wonders what she did. Did she lean too close during a carriage ride? Did he discover her family's estate wasn't as grand as claimed? Was she overheard laughing too loudly at a joke? The terrifying thing, you might never know. Even she might not know. You begin to measure your own steps more carefully. Your replies are softer, your laughter more muted. You watch for signs: an unreturned note, a shorter visit, a distracted gaze. Because once an engagement breaks, even without scandal, the social cost is brutal. For men, there's always another season, another debutante, another introduction. But for you, the window narrows. A second engagement is rare, a third almost unthinkable. People begin to refer to you in past tense. She might have had a good match once. Such a shame. Some women, bold, stubborn, or simply cornered, chose spinsterhood rather than risk humiliation. They took up charitable work, ran schools, or moved in with sisters. Others tried to re-enter society, their smiles brighter, their gowns finer. But the whispers never fully stopped. And yet, occasionally there was redemption. A man who truly cared might ignore the gossip. A marriage abroad might offer a fresh start. A late-in-life match could blossom into something quietly wonderful. But these were exceptions. Most women faded from social calendars like ink in sunlight. You watch Miss Ashby walk past the park gates, now posture straight eyes forward. She wears a smile, not a happy one, a defensive one. You nod politely. She nods back. And for a moment, you wonder how close you've come to sharing her fate. The bells ring softly in the distance, and you're being fitted for your wedding gown, layers of ivory, satin, stiff lace, and a corset that dares you to breathe deeply. You've memorized your vows, rehearsed your smile, and triple-checked the seating chart to ensure no feuding ants are placed side by side. You've said yes to forever without even knowing if he snores. You're getting married to a man you've never been alone with. No late-night talks, no shared confessions in the dark. You've spoken yes about books. Whether family occasionally dreams, but always with others in earshot, always filtered through the velvet screen of Victorian propriety. Now, with the ceremony days away, you realize how little you truly know him. Historians still debate how common this was. Some argue that elite couples were strangers in everything but name. Others suggest deeper emotional connections were simply hidden beneath layers of formality. But either way, the reality for many brides was chillingly simple. They were marrying a hope, not a person. There's no courting period in the modern sense. Engagements were brief, privacy discouraged, and sex education. Let's just say your bridal trousseau includes more handkerchiefs than helpful pamphlets. You've been told marriage is a partnership, but no one's clarified the terms. Fringe tidbit. A popular 19th century marriage manual advised women to approach their wedding night with humility, modesty, and silent endurance. One line reads, "Your husband will take the lead. You need only accept." Comforting. The night before your wedding, you sit by the window holding the letter he sent, a final pre-marriage note. It says you look forward to a shared life of harmony and respect. It's well written, thoughtful, but it reveals nothing. Not about his fears, his habits, his heart. And yet, you want it to work. You've imagined conversations that stretch into midnight, the quiet companionship of someone who knows the shape of your silence. You've imagined laughter, mutual comfort, even affection. Still, you can't help but wonder, what if he snores? What if he's unkind? What if his favorite book isn't Tennyson, and he just said that to impress your father? You try to recall every moment you've shared, his hand brushing yours while handing you a teacup, the way he smoothed his hair before entering the parlor. That one time he nearly smiled when you mentioned your dog's name. They're fragments, hints, not enough. You'll discover who he is after the vows, after the cake, after the carriage door closes, and the two of you are finally alone. It's terrifying. Your mother says not to worry. Affection grows, she assures you. Respect is the foundation. Then she reminds you to smile for the portraits. You nod. Of course. Smile. Be gracious. Wear the veil and pretend you're not standing at the edge of a cliff. Arms out, eyes closed, hoping the landing will be soft. And maybe it will be. Some couples grow together, learn each other's rhythms, build something gentle and enduring out of careful beginnings. But many do not. Some retreat into politeness. Others live parallel lives, cordial, distant, untouched. A few unravel completely trapped in homes where intimacy never arrived, only obligation. You don't know which path will be yours. You only know that tomorrow you will stand before a crowd, say words you were told to memorize, and walk forward into a life with someone who, despite everything, is still a stranger. And you'll smile, because that's what Victorian brides do. There's a small brass bell on the desk and a velvet-covered chair by the fireplace. This is the office of a matchmaker, not the mystical grandmotherly kind from fairy tales, but the Victorian professional clipboard in hand, businesslike, efficient. Because in this era, love could be outsourced. Victorian matchmakers were part social engineer, part therapist, part financial analyst. They didn't just pair people. They navigated reputations, assets, and scandal potential. You might not have met your spouse yet, but your file is already being reviewed. Your family visits a discreet townhouse near Hyde Park. You're there for a fitting, though everyone knows it's about something more delicate, marital logistics. The matchmaker greets you with a practiced smile. She asks questions, not about hobbies or your favorite flower. No, about dowry expectations, your tolerance for country living, your family's history of gout. Romance takes a back seat to real estate. Historians still argue whether matchmakers empowered women by offering more control, or merely extended patriarchal power with better branding. In practice, they were often the only way for those with complications to marry at all. And there were complications. A second daughter with no dowry, a gentleman with an ill mother and shrinking estate, a widow hoping for a second chance. Fringe tidbit. Some matchmakers consulted phrenologists, yes, skull measurers, to assess compatibility. A good forehead slope might indicate fidelity. A strong chin. Passion. If your nose lacked resolve, you might be nudged toward a milder spouse. Others used astrology handwriting analysis, or perhaps most terrifying, recommendation letters from previous acquaintances. Imagine a future husband choosing you based on what your piano instructor wrote. Spiritual advisors also played a role. Mediums were fashionable in the late 19th century, and some claimed to channel romantic guidance from the other side. One infamous clairvoyant matched couples based on visions of shared past lives. Whether this helped the marriage was questionable. But the most enduring tool, the ledger. Matchmakers kept vast handwritten databases, sometimes locked in ornate cabinets filled with names, birth dates, estates, temperaments, and marriage histories. These weren't just documents. They were weapons. Knowledge was leverage. You were more than a daughter now. You were a statistic. And yet some matches worked. A quiet scholar met a retiring vicar's niece and built a life of books and honey. A merchant's son considered difficult found joy with a woman who liked mending clocks. The matchmaker's fee, a tidy sum, was well spent. Still, many matches were built on illusion. One lady married a man based on glowing reports of his poetry. She later discovered the poems were ghost-written by his sister. Another couple shared a fondness for long walks until they realized they meant very different paces. You leave the office with a calling card and a folder. The matchmaker smiles and says, "I feel confident we'll find someone agreeable." You're not sure if she means for you or for your parents. Back home, your mother reviews the notes. Your father mutters about the cost. You look out the window, wondering if one of the names on that list will someday be your husband. You've never met him. But his estate is large. His mother is discreet, and he's never been involved in a scandal. Apparently, that's enough. It's raining softly as you stare out the window, the garden path muddied and quiet. In your lap, a letter rests, one you've read 5 times now. It's not from your fiancé. It's from a friend. A woman you once giggled with at teas and traded glances with across crowded parlors. She's eloped to a butcher's son. The scandal is already brewing, of course. Her parents are devastated. Invitations rescinded. Her name will be absent from church rosters for a while. But beneath all the social smoke, there's something else a spark. She chose love over lineage, a rare, reckless, almost impossible feat. In Victorian society, love across class lines wasn't just discouraged, it was unthinkable. Marriage was a merger, not a gamble. But now and then, someone challenged that. Historians still debate the true frequency of these defiant matches. Some claim they were romantic anomalies. Others say they happened more than we know, just rarely survived public scrutiny. You remember another tale, the Viscount who married his governess. She had read Latin. He admired her mind. His family disowned him for a decade. Another man fell for an actress, charming, clever, unsuitable. He married her anyway, but she was never invited to his sister's wedding. Fringe tidbit. A few couples staged elaborate fictions to elevate one partner before marrying. Faked inheritances, false schooling, even purchased titles. One woman bought a small Scottish parcel and declared herself a landed lady to legitimize a union. It worked for a while, but not all rebellions ended in exile. Some families eventually relented. Love softened the scandal. Children arrived, and the sharp edges dulled. In some cases, the couple even became admired for their bravery, their persistence, their refusal to obey the script. Still, most paid a price. You couldn't marry outside your class without losing something status security invitations. For women especially, the risk was ruin. No inheritance, no protection, and often no return. You fold the letter and tuck it beneath a book. You won't mention it aloud. Not today. But something in you stirs. What would you have done? You think of your own match, safe, sanctioned, stable. But does it hold a flicker of fire? Could it survive if stripped of ceremony and expectation? And then you remember your suitor once confessed he admired the poetry of Keats, even though it's rather unfashionable. That small act of honesty, whispered between teacups, felt like rebellion. Perhaps not every defiance needs thunder. Some revolutions begin with a shared look, a silent agreement, a promise to choose each other, not because you should, but because you do. In the garden, the rain stops. The path is still muddy, but something new is growing beneath the surface. And maybe, just maybe, you'll help it bloom. The credits roll in your mind like a silent film as you sit beside your new husband in the carriage, the leather seat creaking beneath layers of lace and nervous anticipation. You're married now. It's official. The ceremony was polite, the guests abundant, the cake only slightly stale. Your veil is tucked neatly in a hat box, your new surname already whispered by the staff. And as you glance at him, his collar slightly askew, his hair tousled by wind, you realize something strange. This is the first time you've been alone together. No maid in the corner, no cousin lingering by the piano, no mother rearranging sugar tongs. Just you and him and the hush between. Victorian marriage promised security, propriety, structure, but emotional connection, that was up to you. You both sit in this padded space like diplomats from separate empires finally allowed to negotiate in private. He clears his throat. You smile. You comment on the weather, of course. But then he surprises you. He leans slightly forward, not too close, and says, "I've always hated tea, but I drank it every time at your house, just to stay longer." You blink. A confession. Small, silly, unguarded. And suddenly, the entire marriage feels less like a locked room and more like a doorway. Still, the road ahead is unknown. Many Victorian marriages were functional arrangements, duty before desire. Affection grew slowly, or not at all. Some couples lived side by side like well-dressed strangers. Others discovered companionship in shared habits, or a quiet understanding that passed for love. Historians still argue how often happiness bloomed. Diaries offer both despair and delight. A woman who described her husband as a polite ghost, another who wrote, "He still holds my hand when I tremble." Fringe tidbit. One Victorian woman insisted on continuing her correspondence with her fiancé, even after marriage, signing the letters with her maiden name and writing as though they were still courting. He wrote back faithfully for years. Back in the carriage, you try to picture your future. Breakfasts by the window. Arguments over wallpaper. Maybe children. Maybe gardens. Maybe long walks where no one is timing your steps. You look at him again. He's watching the fields roll past, fingers tapping a nervous rhythm on his knee. You place your gloved hand gently over his. He startles slightly, then smiles. It's not a fairy tale. It never was. And once you marry, the illusion fades even faster. Because what comes next isn't romance. It's a contract. And for Victorian wives, that contract rewrote everything. You're about to marry in Victorian England, and if you're expecting a whirlwind honeymoon through the Alps or a moonlit gondola ride in Venice, well, you might want to temper those dreams. For many Victorian wives, the honeymoon was less about passion and more about polite logistics. A brief stopover at a relative's estate, perhaps. A few days in Bath, if you were lucky. But if your marriage was arranged, and let's be honest, many were, Then this post-wedding interlude was often skipped, entirely replaced by awkward dinners and quiet adjustments to shared bedrooms. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where all of you are drifting off from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a borrowed parlor, dress bouquet trembling ever so slightly in your gloved hands. You just said I do, or rather your father did most of the talking. And now everyone's looking at you. The big question is what comes next. In modern terms, the honeymoon is often framed as the joyful exhale after months of planning and Pinterest boards. But in the Victorian age, honeymoons weren't about private beaches or hotel robes. They were rituals of etiquette, status, and appearances. Many involved chaperones, yes, even after the wedding. Some couples weren't even allowed to sleep together for the first few nights. If you were aristocracy, there was a certain choreography to follow. A public departure in a coach with tin cans rattling behind was far too undignified. Instead, your husband might whisk you away to his country estate, or perhaps you'd remain in your new marital home, unpacking your trunk under the critical eye of a housekeeper. Historians still argue whether the rise of the honeymoon in this era was genuinely about romance or just a fancier way to finalize property transfers. After all, the moment the vows were exchanged, you were no longer legally your own person. So while your new husband might be polite, affectionate, even this journey, whether by rail or simply down the hallway, was often more about signaling societal transition than enjoying marital bliss. The middle classes, eager to mimic upper-class customs, often copied the idea of a honeymoon, but lacked the estates and spare time. For them, it might mean one night in a coaching inn with creaky floors and an overcooked supper. Romantic depends how you feel about boiled cabbage. And don't even get started on the lower classes. Working class couples had neither the funds nor the luxury to take time off. A marriage ceremony might be followed immediately by a return to the factory floor, perhaps with a new apron or set of tools as a wedding gift. Then there's the awkward bit. No one talks about intimacy. You might not even know your husband well. Many women entered marriage with no real understanding of sex anatomy or their own bodies. Victorian society treated such topics with an uncomfortable mix of ignorance and euphemism. A honeymoon wasn't necessarily anticipated with excitement. It was often approached with dread, confusion, or simply resignation. You pack your nightdress, maybe stitched by your mother. Maybe one of the few items you were allowed to bring from your old life. You imagine what tonight will hold. But there's a knock at the door. It's your husband's aunt, come to supervise the luggage. And so your honeymoon begins. Or doesn't. You share a carriage watch the countryside, pass nod politely, and wonder when you're supposed to start feeling like a wife. Your husband reads the newspaper. By the time you reach wherever you're going, a family manor, a damp inn, or just the upstairs bedroom, you're not swept away. You're exhausted, nervous, and suddenly very aware of the responsibilities to come. That romantic ideal of a honeymoon as the first step in a lifelong love story. For most Victorian women, it remained just that, an ideal, not a reality. And as you step over the threshold of this new life, you'll realize the real journey isn't where the carriage takes you. It's what you're about to give up. You're awake earlier than usual, not quite rested still, in a room that smells like someone else's lavender drawer sachet. But now, you're no longer a daughter, you're a wife. And with that new title comes a fresh, legally binding truth. You're no longer your own person. You've been handed off quite literally, like a parcel of inheritance. Victorian marriage wasn't just a romantic bond, it was a transaction, a legal shift in custody. Under English common law, when a woman married, she ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. Her husband didn't just gain a partner, he gained rights over her body, her property, her decisions. Your dowry, whether land silver or shares in East India stock, is now his. You too are part of the transfer. And oh, how ceremonious it all was. The father walking you down the aisle. That's not sentimentality. It's symbolic he's passing you his legal responsibility to the groom. Giving away the bride isn't a quaint turn of phrase. It's a reflection of a system that treated women like movable goods. Historians still debate whether this formality originated from Roman law or Germanic tribal customs, but either way, the result is the same. You're now under new management. You might receive gifts, yes, a pearl brooch, a hairbrush, set with your new initials, but they're not really yours. Legally, they belong to your husband. Unless you arranged for a separate estate, a rare protection mostly reserved for the wealthiest and most stubborn of heiresses. Every asset you bring becomes his. Even your clothes, even the locket your grandmother gave you. And if your father included any stipulations in your dowry, your husband is bound by those. But you're not part of that conversation. You weren't invited to the financial meetings. You were measured, not heard. This legal framework is known as coverture, and while we'll come back to its darker implications for now, it's enough to say you've effectively disappeared. On paper, at least. You might think love would soften this handover, and sometimes it did. Some husbands were generous, kind, or even, dare we say, a bit romantic. But the law didn't require that. A man could marry for money, for status, for convenience. And once the vows were said, there was no return policy. There's even the curious case of marriage settlements, legal documents crafted to protect family wealth by specifying what parts of a wife's dowry could or couldn't be touched. These often benefited children, or the wife only if she outlived her husband. It's less a safety net and more a complex estate plan, one that rarely consulted the woman involved. Quirkier still, some families treated daughters' marriages like long-term investments. Marry one daughter to a baronet, and you might secure a seat in Parliament for her brother. Marry another to a wealthy merchant, and you might save the family estate from foreclosure. Love letters be damned, this was matchmaking with ledgers. Of course, the aristocracy had its own rules thick with titles and entailments. You might marry into a family with a crumbling castle, an impeccable pedigree, but zero liquid assets. Your dowry then becomes the mortar, holding that ancient stone together, and in return, you get a name, a coat of arms, and an urgent request to produce an heir. So here you are, sipping tea from a porcelain cup, smiling politely at your new in-laws, trying to remember how many times you've even spoken to this man who now owns your diary, your slippers, your future. And while you may be learning to love him, or at least to tolerate his opinions on croquet, you'll quickly learn that affection in this context is a bonus, not a prerequisite. You might ask, what about the middle class? Surely they were different. Well, sort of. Middle-class marriages were often driven by respectability, not raw economy. But the principles remained. The woman was absorbed into her husband's household. Her name changed her assets, if any transferred. If she was lucky, she got a sewing room. So you fold your gloves, place your wedding ring carefully on the washstand, and begin your first day as a wife, not an equal, not a partner, a possession, carefully transferred, beautifully dressed, and now delicately managed. You glance in the mirror, and she looks familiar, but not quite like you. That name you signed with such flourish only a day ago. It's not yours anymore. Your maiden name, your identity, your legal existence, all swallowed whole by something called coverture. Charming, isn't it? Victorian women, once married, were effectively erased by law. Under the doctrine of coverture, a wife no longer existed separately from her husband. You were now Mrs. John Weatherby, not Eliza Templeton. That witty girl who recited Byron at tea, she doesn't have a signature anymore. Your husband signs everything, pays the bills, owns the furniture. Even your thoughts, legally speaking, echo through his name. The absurdity of this was not lost on contemporary women, or some of the men either. Historians still argue whether coverture was actively oppressive or just a byproduct of a broader patriarchal system. Either way, it felt like a slow disappearance. You could no longer sue in court. You couldn't make a will. If you earned money, it was legally his. Even if you wrote a best-selling novel, and some women did, the profits might go directly to your husband. Unless, of course, you were clever enough to publish under a male pseudonym, Hello Currer Bell. And if you tried to open a bank account, good luck. Most banks wouldn't allow it. Contracts, you couldn't sign one. Property, you couldn't own it. Even if you inherited land, the law presumed your husband would control it. You were legally femme covert, covered by your husband's identity like a hand over a candle. Some women fought back, of course. Activists like Caroline Norton and Barbara Bodichon began pushing for legal reforms by mid-century. Norton's own life was a tangled web of legal horror after separating from her husband. She was denied access to her children and couldn't access her own earnings as a writer. Her pamphlets shocked polite society, well those who could stomach reading them between bites of plum pudding. Still, progress was slow. It wasn't until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, yes, 1870, that wives were granted limited rights to their own income and inheritance. And even then, the act was more of a legal sigh than a roar. True independence required further reforms in 1882 and beyond. You, meanwhile, are stuck in the in-between, expected to smile sweetly at the vicar's wife while remembering you technically no longer exist. Even language reflects your erasure. You're not a woman with opinions, you're spirited, and that's not a compliment. If you assert yourself, you're called troublesome. If you ask too many questions, melancholy. You've become a ghost in a lace collar, seen but not heard loved, perhaps but never autonomous. And what about the upper crust? Those duchesses with tiaras and drawing room dramas. They weren't exempt. Titles and lands followed strict lines of male inheritance. A woman could be fabulously wealthy, but only until she married. Then, like everyone else, she too became a footnote on her husband's ledger. Even the trousseau, the elaborate collection of dresses, linens, and toiletries a bride brought to marriage, was catalogued not as her property, but as part of the household. It was like being drafted into the army with your own luggage, only to be told you're not allowed to open it. You might decorate the nursery, advise the cook, and order stationery embossed with your new initials, but none of it really belongs to you. You are, in essence, the first line of the household ledger, expenses incurred by Mrs. Weatherby, approved by Mr. Weatherby. And here's a curious quirk. Widows regain their legal identity. Only through the death of a husband could a woman become femme sole again, legally able to sign documents, own property, or sue in court. It's grim, but many widows found more freedom than they ever had as wives. Some never remarried. So you adjust your bonnet in the hallway mirror. You write letters careful not to sign your old name. You practice your new signature half with pride, half in mourning. Because beneath the veil and the vows, what you really lost wasn't just a surname. It was the right to exist as yourself. The flowers from the ceremony are already wilting, and so, in a way, is the freedom you briefly tasted during courtship. Remember those walks in the garden, carefully supervised, of course. The charming letters slipped into your glove. The light banter over tea where he laughed at your puns and seemed genuinely interested in your thoughts on astronomy. That's over now. You're married, and with the ring came rules. Courtship in Victorian England could be oddly thrilling if rigid. Suitors performed affection, like theater poems, music. Gentle handkerchief, flirtation. But once you were his wife, the tone shifted. You no longer existed as a mystery to be uncovered. Now, you were a role to be managed. You're up at dawn, instructed by the housekeeper. There's a schedule. You see breakfast arrangements, domestic accounts, visits to the vicar's wife. You quickly learn that a good wife doesn't just smile. She organizes the pantry without ever raising her voice. Love may have gotten you to the altar, but order is what keeps you there. And the roles, they're clearly divided. You're the keeper of the hearth guardian, of the children master of the guest list, yet never the master of yourself. Your husband, meanwhile, strides out into the world, pockets jingling with keys and coin free to make decisions without explaining them. Historians still argue whether the post-wedding shift was due to social pressure or a genuine belief in separate spheres. Either way, the effect was profound. You're now expected to embody moral purity, spiritual leadership, and tireless domestic efficiency, often all before noon. Gone are the flirty glances. Now it's quiet scrutiny. Did you overseason the soup? Were you too cold to your sister-in-law? You're not scolded outright. Of course, no Victorian etiquette prefers silence and subtle punishment. A furrowed brow, an unopened letter, a missed evening stroll. The paradox is sharp marriage was sold as your great goal, your reward for modesty and virtue. Yet once attained, it often felt like a trap. You had more freedom as a girl giggling behind a fan than you do now, wrapped in respectability and hemmed in by rules. And let's not forget the manuals. Entire books existed to teach you how to manage your husband, your servants, your children, and yourself, all without ever appearing to manage anything. The most famous of these, the Wife's Manual, suggested that a gentle smile in place of complaint often preserves harmony. You try it. Your face aches. There's also a code to your clothing. Before marriage, pastel muslins and youthful cuts. After darker silks, higher necklines, fewer frills. You are now visually and behaviorally respectable. That means avoiding loud laughter, never disagreeing in public, and pretending not to hear any vulgar jokes your husband tells at dinner. Even in the bedroom, the shift is clear. As a fiancé, you were to be pure and untouchable. As a wife, you're expected to be available, but never too enthusiastic. Victorian society liked its women, like its wallpaper decorative muted and quietly absorbing the smoke of the room. So you learn to navigate this new terrain with grace, or at least the appearance of it. You perfect the art of responding to a command as if it were a suggestion. You write thank you notes with painfully cheery sentences. You learn not to interrupt when your husband is speaking, unless it's about you, and even then, only to blush modestly. You've gone from the thrill of becoming a wife to the daily effort of performing one. And yet you carry on adjusting the placement of the silverware, just so smiling with a quietness that borders on invisibility. You stand in the drawing room, hands, folded posture, perfect, the picture of serene domestic virtue. But inside, there's a low hum of pressure, soft, yet unrelenting. You are meant to be the angel in the house, a phrase that sounds charming, almost poetic, until you realize what it demands of you. The term comes from a wildly popular 1854 poem by Coventry Patmore, written in honor of his late wife. It celebrates the ideal woman, gentle, self-sacrificing, morally pure, and unfailingly devoted to her husband's needs. Victorian society embraced this image with the enthusiasm of a child clutching a sugar biscuit, ignoring entirely how bitter it might taste if swallowed whole. And so you begin to feel the walls closing in, not of brick or stone, but of expectation. You must be modest, obedient, devout. Your opinions must be softened by smiles. Your happiness, if it exists, should be quiet and neatly pressed. Historians still debate how far-reaching this ideal really was. Did all women believe it? Did all men expect it? Likely not. But it was the standard, whispered through magazines, sermons, novels, and mother-in-law remarks. You don't question it, you perform it. To step outside that image is to risk being labeled unfeminine, unstable, or worst of all, difficult. You write letters using a gentle hand. You show interest in embroidery. You offer warm glances when your husband mentions something tedious about rail investments. And you don't under any circumstances raise your voice. Here's the funny part. Some women leaned into it with terrifying gusto. Entire columns in ladies' journals offered advice on how to remain cheerful while managing an ungrateful husband, or how to hide signs of illness lest you disturb the household mood. A true wife suffers in silence, one read. Lovely. There's a strange beauty to the Victorian home, all polished wood and lace antimacassars. But it's also a stage. And you, dear wife, are both actress and set piece. You're praised for silence, rewarded for sacrifice, admired when you pretend not to want anything at all. Even your relationships with other women are shaped by this angelic mold. Competition is covert compliments laced with warning. If your friend wears too much rouge, she's whispered about. If she speaks too boldly, she's undignified. You learn to smile through everything, even jealousy. And let's not forget the portrait sessions. Every respectable home needed a family painting or photograph to announce domestic bliss. You sit in stiff silk, a toddler on your lap, and smile just so, not too wide. You're not here to show joy. You're here to show containment. And yet, you find tiny ways to resist. A slightly rebellious novel tucked into your sewing basket. A subtle change to the way you arrange your hair. A note to your sister written in sly code. These quiet rebellions don't change the world, but they keep your soul from going entirely threadbare. You start to realize the angelic ideal doesn't just ask for good behavior, it demands invisibility. And that's the trickiest part. You're not praised for what you do, but for how little of yourself you seem to need. So you glide through your home like a well-oiled piece of furniture, always in the right place, always well dusted, always expected to hold everything together without a single creak. The day begins like any other. The bell rings. The curtains open and the world assumes you're content in your domain of doilies and plum preserves. But maybe, just maybe, you had dreams once. Of writing, of painting, of becoming a doctor perhaps. Except now, as a Victorian wife, those ambitions must be folded away like last season's gloves because working. That simply isn't done. In Victorian England, once you married, your career options narrowed to an invisible point. It wasn't merely discouraged for married women to work, it was considered scandalous. Respectability depended on your full-time devotion to home and husband. Earning a wage meant you'd failed in some way, or worse, your husband had. This wasn't just about societal judgment, it was baked into the law. Married women had no legal status to sign employment contracts or control their own wages. Even if you had a trade, it vanished behind your husband's name. You became a non-person in the workforce. If you were a teacher or governess, marriage meant handing in your resignation immediately. Historians still argue whether this rule was truly about protecting family life or merely a way to keep male employment dominant. Either way, you now live in a society that values your submission more than your skills. Upper-class wives were expected to engage in feminine pursuits like watercolors or flower arranging. But these were hobbies, not professions. The moment they generated income, they became dangerous. A published poem. Fine, so long as the profits were routed through your husband. A home-run bakery. Too commercial. Even acting, one of the few semi-accepted paths for ambitious women, came with moral risk and the perpetual suspicion of impropriety. And if you had to work, due to widowhood or family debt, you faced the added burden of being viewed as pitiable or socially fallen. Middle-class women might turn to dressmaking or take in boarders. But any hint that a married woman chose to work was met with raised eyebrows and whispers over tea. The irony, of course, is that you were working constantly. You managed servants, balanced household budgets, oversaw education, nursed the sick, maintained social obligations, and did it all while expected to look serene and untouched by stress. You just didn't get paid for any of it. You might long for an identity beyond the drawing room. But each time you broach the subject, perhaps by suggesting a charity project or a lecture series, you're gently reminded of your delicate constitution or your greater duties at home. You smile, nod, then excuse yourself to cry quietly into your embroidery. Even women with considerable intellect were sidelined. Mary Somerville, a brilliant mathematician, was only taken seriously because her husband supported her research. Without such an ally, she might have been another footnote. Most weren't so lucky, and yet women found loopholes. Some ran businesses secretly through male relatives. Others published anonymously or under male pseudonyms. Quirky fact: in 1865, a woman named Mrs. Beeton published her book of household management, essentially a guide to running a household like a corporation. It was a bestseller, making her one of the few wives who turned domestic labor into recognized expertise. But these stories were the exception. For most Victorian wives, the career path stopped at the altar. What mattered was not what you could do, but how well you could do without. And so your dreams fade, not in flames, but in slow, socially approved silence. You sit still, hands folded on your lap, while the midwife fusses with linen and whispers something about moon cycles. Everyone's watching you now, not for your opinions or artistic talents, but for a bulge beneath your waistband. Because in Victorian marriage, motherhood wasn't optional. It was your destiny, your duty, your daily countdown from the moment the vows were said. The pressure is immense and ever-present. Your worth is now tightly braided with fertility. Producing a child, preferably a male heir, is seen as the highest proof of a wife's success. And should the cradle remain empty, well, you can expect pitying glances, awkward silences at supper, and the faintest scent of suspicion. Is it your fault? Is it divine punishment? Or heaven forbid, did you read too many novels? Victorian science, never one to shy away from poorly supported theories, often blamed women for infertility. Wombs were diagnosed as wandering nervous or hysterical. Treatments ranged from herbal tonics to dubious electrotherapy. Some were merely odd, others downright invasive. Historians still argue whether these so-called cures helped or simply added another layer of humiliation to an already isolating experience. And should you finally conceive, congratulations now. Prepare for constant surveillance. Your diet will be scrutinized. Your activity will be restricted. God forbid you go for a walk without gloves. It might disturb the child's moral fiber. There's an old wives' tale. For every moment, eat too many strawberries, and the baby will be spotted. Read poetry, and it might come out melancholic. The first child brings relief, a moment of triumph in a world that demanded proof. But that joy is short-lived. You'll need to do it again, and again, and again. Birth control was frowned upon, illegal, or simply unreliable. Knowledge of contraception was considered unnatural, sinful, or French. If you whispered too much about it, you could be labeled immoral. So you turn to the remedies your grandmother used, or you seek advice from your housemaid who knows more than the doctor ever will admit. But even if you manage to space your children out, the expectation never wavers. A good wife is also a good mother, and not just to one or two. And what of the consequences of not bearing children? For some, the result was emotional collapse, isolation, or even the threat of divorce. Infertility wasn't just a personal grief, it was a social failing. You were seen as incomplete, sometimes even cursed. And here's the thing, the danger didn't end at conception. Pregnancy was perilous. Childbirth could be a battlefield, and many women didn't survive. There were no epidurals, no reliable antiseptics, and no guarantees. You prepared for birth the same way you might prepare for death, writing letters, arranging your will, saying quiet goodbyes in your head as the pains began. Once the baby arrived, if both of you lived, you were expected to recover swiftly and resume your angelic duties. No one wanted to hear about pain or fear or sadness. That was unbecoming. You'd done your job. Now be grateful. Smile. Sing lullabies in a well-modulated tone. Of course, if the baby wasn't healthy, or worse, didn't survive, the grief was yours to swallow quietly. Mourning was permitted, but only within limits. There were black dresses and mourning brooches, yes, but also the silent expectation that you would bear up and try again. Still, women found pockets of agency in this relentless cycle, naming a child after a beloved sister, sneaking peppermint oil into the birthing room, telling stories late at night of their own mother's quiet strength. These tiny acts became threads of resistance, stitching dignity into an undignified system. So you pace the nursery, counting tiny breaths, wondering if this one will sleep through the night. You press a kiss to a downy forehead and offer up a prayer you barely believe in anymore, because here in the hush of the rocking chair, you realize something terrible and true in this society. You are most valued when you are exhausted, aching, and full of someone else. The door closes behind you, and suddenly you're alone with him. The wedding ring still feels foreign on your finger, and the sheets are neatly turned down, tucked tight by some too efficient maid. There's a strange hush in the room, like the air is waiting. But here's the thing, no one prepared you for in marriage sex isn't a mutual expression of affection. It's a duty, yours. Victorian wives were not expected to desire intimacy. In fact, desiring it could be a sign of moral weakness. Instead, you were supposed to endure it quietly with grace. You submitted. You complied. You didn't talk about it, question it, or heaven forbid, enjoy it. That would be unseemly. The marriage bed wasn't a private sanctuary. It was a moral obligation. Many believed quite sincerely that a wife had no right to refuse her husband. Consent, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist in the same way. Once married, you were assumed to be perpetually consenting. Legally, marital rape wasn't recognized in Britain until 1991. Yes, 1991. Historians still argue whether Victorian men truly believed their wives were passionless or whether they just preferred it that way. Either way, the expectation was clear. You were there to serve, not to want. Popular advice books recommended wives lie still and think of the empire. That quote is often misattributed, but the sentiment all too real. Religious doctrine didn't help. Christian teaching often framed sex as a wife's marital duty, her conjugal debt. Refusing could be seen as sinful. So many women prayed to feel nothing. Others took laudanum. Some dissociated entirely, focusing on the ceiling roses or reciting silent psalms. This was especially grim for women who feared pregnancy. With no reliable contraception, every encounter was a risk. You might carry a child again and again until your body gave out, and yet to refuse social suicide. Not that men were immune from sexual pressure. They were told they had needs, and that wives were there to prevent immoral outlets. Brothels thrived during the Victorian period, their clientele well-heeled and hypocritical. Some men justified their visits by claiming they were sparing their wives. Others didn't bother with justifications at all. Curiously, a double standard bloomed in full. Women were expected to be virgins pure and untouched, while men were often given a silent pass for premarital or extramarital experiences. One Victorian husband was quoted as saying he wanted a wife like a delicate vase, untouched and unstained. But you don't display a vase in a bedroom, do you? This imbalance had medical consequences too. Syphilis spread rampantly through polite society, not via scandalous affairs, but from husbands infecting their innocent wives. Women bore the consequences, often without knowing the cause. Doctors would treat symptoms quietly, and husbands would plead ignorance. It was the ultimate betrayal wrapped in marital decorum. Some women found ways to reclaim a sliver of control. Feigning illness was common. Scheduling the bedroom routines carefully around menstrual cycles or invented ailments. But even these were fragile defenses. A truly determined husband could insist, and the law would stand with him. Over time, some couples built trust and found affection within this restrictive system. But that wasn't the baseline, it was the exception. For many, sex in marriage was a silent transaction, a service rendered, a page in the calendar. You blow out the lamp. The mattress creaks. You lie still, counting heartbeats, wondering if this is how it will always feel, like something being taken, not shared. And when it's over, no one asks how you are. You fix your nightdress, say nothing, and close your eyes, trying not to dream at all. The candles are low, and the baby's finally asleep again. You tiptoe past a creaky floorboard, exhale silently, and settle into a chair where you'll stay for hours, invisible and indispensable. The day has drained your body, but not your mind. That's still racing, tallying chores and moods, whispered slights and future plans. Welcome to the emotional labor of Victorian marriage. An entire job category with no name and no thanks. You're not just keeping the household running. You're keeping everyone sane. Your husband comes home grumpy from a board meeting. You soothe him with tea and just the right level of silence. Your child seems withdrawn. You observe gently, adjust routines, maybe write to the doctor discreetly, of course. Your sister-in-law makes a remark about your second gown being rather last season. You smile, then cry into your pillow later, quietly. This labor has no wage and no clock-out time. It's the unspoken effort behind every smooth evening, every balanced dinner party, every well-behaved child. And yet, it's as invisible as your legal status. You're praised for the outcomes, never the work. Historians still debate whether this silent labor was a form of oppression or a clever way women exerted influence in a male-dominated world. Certainly, you could shape your household's mood, nudge your husband's decisions, even sway social alliances. But the cost: constant emotional vigilance. You anticipate needs before they're voiced. You absorb anxieties like wallpaper absorbs smoke. You pen letters on your husband's behalf, remind him of birthdays, smooth over conflicts he's too proud or too oblivious to notice. Even in grief, your job doesn't pause. A miscarriage, a stillbirth, you weep, then you comfort others. You host relatives, you keep appearances, because you're the anchor, and anchors don't drift even in storms. Curiously, even literature of the time acknowledged this invisible strain. Take Dickens, for instance. His ideal women are endlessly patient, endlessly sacrificing, always available for comforting words or quiet advice. But rarely, if ever, do they get to collapse. Even when they die, they do it gently and don't get too emotional. Victorians prized restraint in women. Hysteria, sadness, even anger had to be bottled tightly lest you be dismissed as unstable. If you needed to vent, it had to be coded a longer walk in the garden, a bit more starch in the linens, a louder than usual piano practice session. Social outings were a test of this invisible skill set. You had to monitor everyone's moods smooth, every awkward moment, adjust your behavior on the fly. A perfect evening meant no one noticed how hard you worked to keep it perfect. There were rewards, of course. Respect, a sense of order, the occasional compliment on your grace. But these were fleeting, and they rarely matched the scale of the effort required. And here's the oddest part. If you did your job too well, no one even knew you were doing it. Your home just ran smoothly. Your husband was in good spirits. Your children seemed happy. But behind it all was you operating like a hidden lever system, constantly adjusting and absorbing and smoothing. So you tuck the baby back in, close the curtains, and return to your sewing chair. Outside, the house is quiet. Inside, your mind is loud with lists, worries, observations, and one persistent thought: no one sees this. But you do it anyway, because that's what a good wife does. Or so they say. You wake before the house does again, with your thoughts pressing harder than the bed frame. The baby's cry last night still echoes in your ears, but you're not sure whether it actually happened or if you only dreamed it. Either way, no one asks how you slept, or if you slept, or if you felt like crying for 2 weeks straight. Because in Victorian England, mental health doesn't exist, not for wives, not for mothers, not really. If you feel tired beyond explanation, forgetful, or weighed down by a gray sadness that won't lift, there's no term for that, not one that's kind anyway. Melancholia, perhaps, nerves, or that dreaded catch-all hysteria. But postpartum depression, that phrase won't exist for another century. You're not sad, you're delicate. You're not anxious, you're overexcited. And you definitely shouldn't talk about it. The silence around women's mental health was thick and heavily perfumed. Even physicians, almost always male, viewed female suffering as exaggerated or imaginary. One of the most common prescriptions: rest. Complete, motionless, isolated rest. Which is how the infamous rest cure came about. where women were confined to bed for weeks, sometimes months, forbidden from reading, writing, or even talking. Just lie still. Heal, in theory. Historians still argue whether the rest cure helped or harmed. What's clear is that many women found it deeply distressing. Charlotte Perkins Gilman famously fictionalized her own experience in The Yellow Wallpaper, where the protagonist, confined for her nerves, slowly loses her mind and merges with the wallpaper pattern. It wasn't far from reality. If your distress broke through the silence, if you cried too often, collapsed in church, or lashed out at your husband, there were institutions for that. Asylums filled with women diagnosed with vague conditions like moral insanity or religious mania. Some were committed against their will, sometimes on the testimony of a husband or relative. Some never came out. You might be tempted to confide in a friend, but even that has risks. Word spreads quickly. You might be seen as unstable, and instability in a wife is social poison. You'll find fewer invitations, more sidelong glances, a sudden cooling in your mother-in-law's tone. So, you keep it all inside. Maybe you take laudanum generously prescribed for female complaints. Maybe you try home remedies, lavender pillows, vinegar tonics, cold compresses behind the ears. Maybe you cry in the scullery when no one's around. And heaven help you if you're too cheerful. That's not right either. Excessive gaiety can be a sign of hysteria too. One medical text suggested that chattiness in females may indicate overstimulation of the womb. Yes, your uterus might be blamed for everything from headaches to opinions. There's a cruel irony in this. You're expected to manage everyone else's emotional life while silently disintegrating under your own. The same society that praises your patience and empathy offers no space for your sadness. Upper-class women had the luxury of privacy, at least. Middle and working-class wives didn't. They were expected to push through grief exhaustion and trauma because the laundry still needed folding and the grocer still needed paying. One fringe tidbit. Some women turn to spiritualism for comfort, seances, ghost writing mediums. Not just for fun, but as a space where emotions could be expressed without judgment. Crying over a lost child was acceptable if it happened during a seance. A message from the beyond gave grief a socially acceptable script. You, however, sit quietly in your parlor. You smile when spoken to. You nod through Sunday sermons about joy and suffering. You write in your diary carefully, vaguely, in case someone reads it. And at night, you lie awake staring at the ceiling, roses wondering if the ache in your chest is just fatigue or something else entirely. The morning paper rustles across the breakfast table as your husband clears his throat. You've been arguing carefully, of course, for weeks. There's no abuse, not exactly, but there's distance, silence, coldness that seeps into the corners of every room. And you start to wonder, could you leave? The answer in Victorian England is yes, but only in theory. In practice, divorce is a social guillotine, and the blade falls hardest on you. Before 1857, divorce required a literal act of Parliament. Yes, an individual act, like naming a holiday or declaring war. Only the very wealthy could afford such drama. After the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, a civil divorce court was established, allowing the process to occur outside the ecclesiastical system. A step forward, surely. But here's the catch. it still wasn't remotely fair. If you're a husband, you need only prove your wife committed adultery. Simple. Clean. Case closed. If you're a wife, you must prove not just adultery, but aggravated offenses, cruelty, desertion, incest, or bestiality, often with witnesses. And even then, the court might side against you. Historians still argue whether the system was designed to protect marriage or simply to punish women who stepped out of line. Either way, the cost of leaving was astronomical. Socially, financially, reputationally, you'd lose it all. You become a divorced woman. That phrase alone carries a scent of scandal. Invitations vanish. Friendships cool. Even your own family might withdraw. Your name appears in newspaper columns dissected like a play review. And don't count on keeping your children. The courts typically favored the father, because naturally, an adulterous or emotional mother must be unfit. Even if your husband was cruel, if he hit you, drank excessively, or neglected you, you still might not be believed. And if you ran away, you could be legally forced to return, or worse, imprisoned. Some women were declared insane simply for resisting domestic authority. Your legal options are limited. Solicitors hesitate to take your case unless you're wealthy or connected. Court proceedings are public. Your personal letters may be read aloud, witnesses called. Your private life becomes theater, and the audience is cruel. Let's say you succeed. You get the divorce. You are free. But no, what? You can't remarry easily. Few men are willing to take on a ruined woman. You may be cut off from your inheritance. Your children may be raised without you. Employment. Perhaps as a governess, if your name doesn't carry too much shame. If your husband divorced you for infidelity, even real or fabricated, you might be labeled a fallen woman. A term so vague, and yet so damning, it could ruin your entire social existence. Even fictional women couldn't escape this fate. Think of Anna Karenina, Emma Bovary, or Lady Deadlock. Literary divorcees didn't get redemption. They got death. Suicide, snow-covered train tracks, poison, and shame. That was the cultural script, and so most women stayed. They endured. They adapted. They became masters of compromise, of subtle rebellion, of emotional retreat. They raised their children. They managed their households. They lived lives of quiet resistance because truly escaping, required a price few could pay. Still some did. Brave, battered, desperate, determined. They walked into the courthouse knowing what they'd lose and did it anyway. A few even rebuilt lives, though rarely without scars. You look across the table at your husband. He asks for the butter. You pass it. Your fingers tremble slightly, but your face remains composed. Because in this world, leaving your marriage is possible. But surviving the consequences, that's another story. You wake up beside a man you still barely know. It's been months, maybe years, and yet there are days you feel like a guest in your own life. You know how he takes his tea, how he folds his cravat, even how he snores, but you don't know if he actually likes you. Not really. Because in the Victorian era, marriage often began not with love, but with introductions, negotiations, and very limited conversation. Marriages weren't always arranged in the strictest sense, but they were certainly engineered. Families orchestrated matches with all the finesse of diplomats brokering a treaty. Compatibility wasn't about shared interests or sparkling chemistry. It was about class income, land lineage, and maybe, if you were lucky, mutual politeness. You might meet your future husband at a church picnic or a piano recital. Maybe he danced with you twice at the harvest ball. You exchanged a few letters. He complimented your embroidery. Suddenly, you were engaged. Victorian courtship was brief, structured, and heavily chaperoned. Real intimacy, emotional or physical, was discouraged. It wasn't just unseemly to know your partner too well. It was suspicious. Too much closeness implied impropriety. So couples went from stiff conversation to lifelong commitment with alarming speed. Historians still argue whether this emotional distance was intentional or simply a side effect of social norms. But many couples entered marriage not with passion, but with paperwork. And once the vows were said, you discovered that a shared surname did not guarantee shared affection. You learned to navigate his silences, his little habits, the way he double knocks the table before rising, or the way he avoids your gaze when you mention your sister. You become fluent in the unspoken language of distance. There are couples who grow into love, the slow warming of hearts through shared routines and familiar glances. But those stories are rare, whispered with envy at sewing circles or read in serialized novels. For most, the reality is more mundane, polite cohabitation, minimal friction, and separate emotional worlds. Communication was often formal and indirect. If something upset you, you didn't confront. You hinted, or you wrote a note, or you said nothing and hoped he'd notice. He usually didn't. And the bedroom, still as awkward as ever, without shared emotional intimacy, physical closeness could feel like theater performed out of duty, not desire. You might wonder if he feels the same, but you never ask. Even holidays meant to be restful often became separate experiences. He went on shooting weekends. You visited your mother. Letters were exchanged with the tone of a cordial acquaintance. Hope the weather suits your health. Not exactly steamy. You read novels Bronte Gaskell Austen, and you wonder if those heroines were luckier. At least they argued with their suitors. At least they had banter. You try to remember if your husband has ever laughed at one of your jokes. One quirky tidbit. Some couples kept separate bedrooms, not out of animosity, but out of preference. Privacy in a world with few true refugees was its own kind of intimacy, or its absence. Eventually, you stop expecting butterflies. You look for kindness instead, or at least decency. A cup of tea left for you in the morning. A door opened without prompting. A hand resting gently on your shoulder during a funeral. Because here's the truth. No etiquette manual dares whisper. Many Victorian wives were married to strangers. Men they barely knew. Men they learned to tolerate, to work around, to live beside. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, you wonder what it might have been like to marry for love. To marry someone who knew you not just your face or your father's income, but your mind, your humor, your heart. You set the table. He enters, nods, sits, says, "Thank you, dear." And in that tiny moment, you search his tone for anything more. It's easy to assume that upper-class Victorian wives had it easier. After all, they had parlor maids, cooks, gardeners, and carriages. They didn't scrub floors or mend hems under candlelight. But here's the secret: servants didn't equal freedom. In fact, they often made your life even more constricted. You might be the lady of the house, but that house is a stage, and every servant is a quiet audience. Your every word is heard. Your mood, observed, your habits noted and discussed in the kitchen with alarming speed. The cook knows what you ate. The maid knows how long you lingered in the nursery. The butler, he knows everything. You don't clean, but you manage. You review accounts, plan menus, handle letters of reference, and oversee the rota of the entire household staff. And woe unto you if someone's bonnet isn't washed in time for the Easter picnic. You'll be blamed politely, of course, and always in whispers. Historians still argue whether upper-class women truly held power in these arrangements or were simply the illusion of authority. Yes, you could fire a scullery maid, but could you speak freely in your own drawing room? That's less certain. Every room has its expectations. You must host elegantly, but not too ostentatiously. You must know when to speak and when to smile. You must correct the housemaid's posture without being cruel, and you must never ever let anyone know that the household is running on the edge of chaos. Even fashion is a full-time job. You don't dress yourself, no, that would be scandalous. But you must direct your lady's maid, approve fabrics, ensure your hemline is 2 inches below fashionable risk. You must never repeat a gown at the wrong kind of party. Your days are carefully choreographed. Morning letters, visits to the vicar, an inspection of the silver. Maybe a piano lesson with your daughter. Maybe a headache that allows for 10 minutes of solitude, though even that comes with a knock from the housekeeper. And despite being surrounded by people, you're profoundly alone. Your husband's in his study or out riding. Your children are in the nursery under a governess's eye. The only adult conversation you hear might be about the gardener's wages or Mrs. Featherstone's increasingly orange complexion. Even your decisions are double-checked. You want to change the curtains, perhaps your husband prefers the blue. You wish to invite an old school friend. She's not quite the right sort for our current circles. You smile, nod, compromise, again. Some women manage to carve out power here. Subtle social strategic. A well-placed compliment to the right bishop's wife. A brilliant season for your daughter on the marriage market. A household known for its efficiency and moral rectitude. But this power had limits. It didn't open the front gate. It didn't let you leave. One curious fact: Victorian etiquette manuals included entire chapters on how to manage servants without appearing tyrannical. There were rules on how to speak to a cook, how to fire a footman, even how to write thank you notes to someone who cleaned your chamber pot. There was a script for everything except how to be free. Because while you may be in charge of a bustling household, you're not in charge of your own time. You host dinners you don't enjoy, speak with guests you barely tolerate, and politely accept your husband's schedule as your own. You live in a house you oversee, but not one you own. You hold the keys to the linen closet, but not your future. And so you walk through polished hallways, checking vases and scolding dust motes, smiling as if it were all a privilege. Because to complain would seem ungrateful. After all, you have servants. You wear silk. You host balls. But you also have no escape. The church bells toll gently through the mist, their chimes drifting through the hedgerows like soft reprimands. You straighten your bonnet, nod to the vicar's wife, and take your place in the pew. Sundays are sacred, but not for rest, for endurance. Religion in Victorian England wasn't just a personal matter. It was a structure, a surveillance system, a script for womanhood written in gilded margins. And for married women, it was especially sharp-edged. The sermons are full of phrases like obedient helpmate, God's appointed hierarchy, and blessed in suffering. You clutch your prayer book tighter. You're told gently, often sweetly, that your role is to submit, that your suffering is not only expected but sanctified, that the greater your silence, the louder your virtue sings in heaven. It's little wonder that so many Victorian marriage guides used scripture to enforce domestic submission. One of the most quoted verses, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands." You could recite it in your sleep. In fact, you probably do. Historians still argue whether Victorian clergy truly believed women were spiritually inferior, or if they simply feared what might happen if women were treated as equals. Either way, the message remained: a holy wife is a quiet one. Religious tracts emphasized that a woman's trials, especially in marriage, were part of God's divine plan. Your husband may be difficult, distant, even cruel, but your patience is your offering. Your suffering a step toward sainthood. To rebel is not just socially risky, it's spiritually dangerous. The idea of Christian endurance wasn't just preached, it was printed, painted, and needle-pointed onto cushions. Blessed are the meek, stitched in burgundy floss on your drawing room wall, is less a beatitude and more a behavioral reminder. You confide in the minister's wife tentatively. She nods, hands you a well-worn pamphlet titled "Comfort for the Weary Wife." Inside are poems about patience, parables about long-suffering saints, and a list of daily Bible readings titled "For Those Who Struggle with Pride." You thank her. You go home. You cry quietly over the stove. Even in private prayer, the expectation is shaped by doctrine. You pray not for deliverance, but for strength to endure. Not for change, but for acceptance. You ask for grace to be sweeter, softer, more cheerful under strain. Because that is what God and society has asked of you. There's no room in this theology for anger. No space for resentment. Those are sins. A wife's frustration must be transformed into humble service. If you feel bitterness, that's your spiritual failing, not your husband's fault. It's a tidy trap. The worse your marriage, the greater your chance to prove your piety. And yet beneath the hymns and incense, a quiet resistance grows. Some women begin to question these interpretations. They form reading circles. They write letters. They discover Quaker ideas of equality or Unitarian leanings that suggest God might not require your suffering after all. One fringe detail: a few radical religious sects in the late 19th century actually preached gender equality, but they were small, controversial, and mostly ignored. Still, the seeds were there. But for now, you sing the hymns. You nod at the reverend's sermon. You lead grace at dinner, thanking the Lord for boiled turnips and a husband who remembered your name today. You wear your Sunday best. You keep your Bible close. You repeat the verses that are expected of you, not because you always believe them, but because they are your armor, your alibi, your camouflage in a world where faith is measured in how quietly you suffer. You sit alone in the parlor, the fire crackling gently, casting shadows that dance across the gilt-framed wedding portrait above the mantel. You look up at your painted self, bright-eyed, barely 20, clutching a bouquet and a dream, and you wonder not, for the first time, was there ever love in this house? Victorian marriage was built on pillars of duty, inheritance, and obedience. Love, if it existed, was an afterthought, a sentimental flourish on the margins of a legal contract. You were never promised affection. You were promised protection, provision, and perhaps a piano in the drawing room. But warmth, intimacy, that was rare, and yet it did happen. Among the quiet routines and well-rehearsed smiles, some couples stumbled into tenderness, not fireworks, but the slow, smoldering kind of connection built over shared cups of tea and the quiet recognition of a glance. You might grow fond of his awkward jokes. He might notice when you're tired and say nothing, but hold your hand under the table during a sermon. But for most, the day-to-day reality of Victorian marriage left little room for affection to bloom. Roles were rigid, conversations scripted. You managed the household, he managed the finances. You shared a roof, a name, children, and linens, but not necessarily a life. Historians still argue whether love was expected to come after marriage or not at all. The idea of marrying for love was a rising ideal by the late 19th century, but it was still not the norm. Most women were taught to expect contentment, not passion, gratitude, not equality. And if you longed for more, you had to be discreet. Romantic novels were both comfort and cautionary tale. You might weep over Jane Eyre, but you knew not to look longingly at the stable boy. That way lay ruin or worse poetry. There were exceptions, of course. Letters have survived that reveal true devotion between Victorian couples. Pet names inside jokes, flirtation that aged like good wine. But these are the rare letters, the ones kept in secret drawers and tied with ribbon. The public face of marriage remained dutiful and decorous. One bittersweet truth: many women only found love after their husband's death. Freed from performance, they remembered the better parts of him, or discovered friendships that bloomed in widowhood. There's something haunting about that love became easier to feel once obligation was lifted. You put away your embroidery. The clock ticks on. Outside, the world is changing votes for women, bicycles, telephones. The future promises something freer, perhaps. But you lived within the lines. Still, you made a life. You found joy in small rebellions. A flower tucked behind your ear. A midnight laugh. A quiet poem never shared. Maybe that was love too. The fire dies down. You fold the shawl over your shoulders and whisper a good night to no one in particular. And as the embers glow softly, you wonder if love was rare in your world, then maybe the real miracle is that you still searched for it anyway. The fire fades now, and the house settles into stillness. The weight of silk, dresses, the rustle of calling cards, the heavy hush of unsaid words all drift gently into memory. Your hands, once so busy with stitching and smoothing, rest now in your lap. Quiet, calm. You've walked through parlors and prayer books, endured expectations wrapped in lace, and learned to smile through storms. Your story, like so many Victorian wives, was not about grand romance or sweeping change. but about subtle endurance, soft strength, grace under constraint. The world outside still moves. New voices rise, new laws, new loves, new lives. But here, in this last gentle breath of the past, you can let go of the scripts and standards. Just for a moment, you close your eyes. Imagine warm hands without demands, a room with no audience, a name that is yours alone. Let your breath slow now. Inhale the scent of old books and lavender water. Exhale the clatter of teacups and the weight of borrowed rolls. You did what you could with what you had, and now you rest not in lace-trimmed silence, but in the peaceful hush of understanding. The night is yours now. No rules, no roles, just rest. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who still believes Victorian love was all moonlight and roses. And don't forget to subscribe, because next time we're peeling back another romantic myth you thought was true.